Welcome back to the analysis of social power. Lord Acton, the British historian, wrote frequently and eloquently about power, government, influence. For example, he once wrote, "Remember, where you have concentration of power in the hands of few, all too frequently men with the mentality of gangsters get control. History has proven that." He also wrote that the danger is not that a particular class is unfit to govern. Every class is unfit to govern. He also opined, I disagree with you, that the judgment of popes and kings should be unlike the judgment of other men. But perhaps we know him best for his law of power. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Researchers have recently experimentally tested Lord Acton's analysis of power and its effects on people by experimentally manipulating people's feelings of power. They prime power, and then they see what the consequences might be. For example, they'll ask people to think of a time when they were once powerful, and then examine the psychological cascade that occurs following that. They may put people in a pseudo-group situation and identify them as the leader and ask them then to take action. In some cases, the manipulation is quite subtle. In one particular study of college students, when they came for the experiment, rather than sitting where students generally sit in a college professor's office, they were asked to sit in the professor's chair, and then their behavior was examined. The question is, how does the acquisition of power, even the psychological acquisition of power, the feeling of being powerful, how does it change people? Let's talk briefly about that, and we'll discuss how power changes the individual who has power, the power holder, and also examine the change that people experience when they lose power or when they're just in a situation where they lack power altogether. We'll begin the analysis with Keltner's approach inhibition model of power. He suggests that the power generates an approach response. It generates energy. It generates positive affect. It's the tendency to take action, to move forward. It's an energizing kind of experience, whereas powerlessness is the opposite of that. It inhibits behavior. It tends to generate the absence of affect, or even more negatively, negative affect. It prompts people to respond automatically, generating controlled responses rather than thoughtful, instrumental responses. So looking at the psychological impact of increases in power, there is a series of positive consequences that powerful individuals tend to be more proactive, they're more engaged, they're more likely to take response, they're more frequently the first person to speak in the room, their emotions tend to be more positive. People enjoy emotionally the experience of having power. They tend to shift towards becoming goal focused, so they are both active but seeking out things. Their cognitive functioning appears to be enhanced. They can process information more rapidly. It sharpens their mental acuity to some degree. They can track information more clearly. Even work using fMRI technologies, examining the brains of individuals who feel powerful suggests that their brains are more active, particularly in the information processing areas, than individuals who don't feel powerful. It also tends to wall the individual off from attempts from influence by others when individuals experience power. But power has a downside as well. Individuals tend to engage in more risky behaviors. Their plans tend to be riskier rather than more cautious. They tend to be feeling more positive themselves, but they negatively influence the emotional experiences of others. There's a tendency, even though they're capable of processing more information, they're less interested in processing information about other people. So their social attentiveness tends to drop down. They have a drop in empathy, and even perhaps a drop in concern for people's outcomes, others' well-being. They tend to increase in self-esteem and self-satisfaction. Powerful individuals, if given the opportunity to use coercive methods, will tend to use them, in fact, to influence other individuals. So they do tend to show signs of being less compassionate, less ethical. In one excellent analysis of this process that Dasher Keltner and his colleagues conducted, they put individuals in situations where they were speaking to another person who was talking about a stressful experience or a less stressful experience. So the talker's level of distress was either low or high. And then they charted the listener's level of compassion. They also manipulated whether or not the person felt powerful, high power listener, or low power listener. So what you found with the low power listener, their compassion increased as the person they were listening to expressed more and more distress. The reverse occurred for a high power listener. When there was little distress in the conversation, the high power individual was a good listener, even a better listener than the low power individual. But as stress increased, their level of compassion decreased overall. So they showed less concern for the other person's well-being. Analyses of leaders frequently ask the question, why do so many individuals who in positions of authority engage in negative behaviors? This tendency has been sometimes labeled the Bathsheba syndrome, after the biblical story of King David, who fell in love with Bathsheba, who was married to someone else at the time. But King David, although a highly ethical individual, began taking steps to secure Bathsheba for himself. And eventually those steps resulted in the death of Bathsheba's husband. So this Bathsheba syndrome is a general overall term to describe how leaders, and in fact even leaders who are morally upright individuals, tend, as a result of the transformative effects of power, to undergo psychological changes which result in these individuals engaging in unethical behaviors. This particular story looks at naval commanders who tend to engage in inappropriate behavior at sea with their subordinates. Studies of the reactions to the use of power. What do people do who don't have a good deal of power? How do they respond to that situation? In some cases, as Keltner's theory suggests, they lose energy, they are less responsive, they comply in the face of power. But in other cases, they might resist that influence. So they might form revolutionary coalitions where they resist the authority. Darrell Brem's analysis of reactance processes suggests that all of us have a tendency to resist an authority's temptation, and in many cases our rebellion of one might ripple through the rest of the group. Kelman's theory of the transformative effects of power is well known. He developed his theory in the early 1960s to try to explain how individuals who initially might resist a powerful individual's convert over time. He suggests it's a three-stage process where initially group members comply with the power holder demands, but they are simply complying. They do not personally agree with the power holder in his or her position. The power holder has to monitor their behavior and perhaps use threats and rewards to gain compliance. But over time, the group members' compliance with the demands of the power holder shift, and they are motivated then by a desire to please the authority, and that maybe perhaps even imitate the authority. This is when identification increases. So the members are more likely to mimic the power holder's actions and values, and eventually this process results in internalization. So the group members follow the orders and advice of the power holder because they view them as congruent with their own personal values. Obedience overall can lead to very destructive responses if those who are not empowered simply go along with the negative authority and don't respond to the authority with corrective feedback. The negative results are likely. Milgram's experiment, of course, demonstrated that. Milgram, in trying to explain his own findings, suggested that too often the subjects fell into an agentic state. They became agents of the experimenter's authority and were not thinking through the consequences of their behavior. Philip Zimbardo also suggests that perhaps his subjects in his famous prison study also responded so passively because they fell into the role of prisoner and did not challenge the authority of the guards. And this brief clip illustrates that.
In the early 1970s, an experiment on the psychology of imprisonment was carried out at Stanford University by psychologist Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues, who created their own jail in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The students who volunteered for the study were carefully tested. Each had to be psychologically and physically healthy to participate. Some students were then randomly selected to act as prisoners, while others became guards. The researchers surprised the prisoners by having them arrested at their homes and dormitories. The prisoners went a series of rituals to establish their new lowly status. They lived in tiny cells 24 hours a day, cut off from their usual surroundings.
What is happening to prisoner 819? Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Let's see reply time. Make sure you remember it. Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Down. Up.
The guards, however, only worked 8-hour shifts, and they returned to their normal routines as students when off the job.
Up. 546 in our belly roll. Push up. Keep that back straight. Down.
What happened surprised everyone, including Zimbardo. The illusion became the reality. The boundary between the role each person was playing and his real personal identity was erased.
You have to find Mr. Correctional Officer. Now keep it straight.
Nice boys became brutal guards. Healthy kids got sick.
Get in that box then. You're not going to hurt a kid before we say.
Active ones became passive and zombie-like prisoners. The situation became so overpowering that many of the prisoners developed extreme stress reactions and had to be released. But no one ever said, "I quit the experiment." They had lost all perspective.
You go over there. You should act it out. You be the bride of Frankenstein, and you be Frankenstein. I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love children and trees.
What kind of guard would you be? Sadistic or supportive? Would you be a conforming prisoner or a heroic resistor?
The question that the narrator raises is a pretty critical one, that both the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo experiment raise questions of ethics. But looking beyond them, they also raise questions about fundamentals of human nature and how individuals should respond when they find themselves in positions of authority. To summarize, authority is essential to group life. Groups need to be organized, particularly when they grow large in size. There must be coordinated effort, and in many cases, leaders are required to coordinate that effort. Yet, authorities that overstep their boundaries can undermine members' motivations, create conflict, and break the bonds between the members. So when you are in a position of an authority, you must be wary of your power, for power is easily misused. We should always question authority, so that the natural tendency, the negative tendencies for power to lead to negative psychological consequences is subdued and minimized if possible, and the positive effects of power maximized. Thank you for joining me in the analysis of power and group dynamics.